And thank you to the Graduate Institute for inviting me here. And yes, as Adam said, I co-authored this piece with two colleagues, Michelle Rourke and Stephanie Switzer, who were instrumental in writing this, but I'm here to do the actual presentation. The other thing to note is that I'm happy for the slides to be shared. They're very text heavy. There's a lot of content to get through. When it came to writing the report, Adam asked us to write 4 pages. We wrote 18 and handed it to Adam to cut down because we didn't know what to leave in and whatnot. So there's lots more material to look through. As we've heard a little bit from some of our earlier speakers, this idea of access and benefit sharing originates in the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, which grants or recognizes that states have sovereign rights over their genetic resources and that access to these resources shall be done on prior informed consent and on mutually agreed terms. And pathogens are accepted to be within the scope of the definition of genetic material for the CBD. Whether that's the right thing is a totally other question, a different question, but it's very clear that pathogens are within scope now. And the CBD, together with the Nagoya Protocol, creates this bilateral access and benefit sharing system for genetic resources, which says fundamentally genetic resources from within a country's territory can only be accessed and used by parties who have prior informed consent, and this is to be achieved on mutually agreed terms. This is the default position for access and benefit sharing. So almost all access and benefit sharing to almost all genetic resources around the world happens at this bilateral level. Other more specialized access and benefit sharing systems are trying to create and have created multilateral access and benefit sharing systems, which try to make the access of prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms much more efficient, whereby you bypass the need for having to negotiate with individual countries for every single sample you wish to use, and you have this centralized pooling of resources and a centralized pooling of benefits in return. Things like, as we've heard, the PIP framework, but we also have the BBNJ for marine genetic resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and the plant treaty being the most established, longer-serving multilateral access and benefit sharing system. As we heard a little bit about earlier, there's also been this rise of dematerialization, creating digital sequence information or genetic sequence data, which allows users to potentially bypass the need to have access to physical genetic resources and do more of the research and development process using data alone. And as a result, very recently, the Convention on Biological Diversity decided to create a multilateral benefit sharing fund and the benefit sharing mechanism and the Cali Fund for digital sequence information. This is a voluntary mechanism which users who are thought to use digital sequence information are hoped to contribute to on a voluntary basis. This started about 6 months ago, and as of today, there are no financial contributions to the Cali Fund as of yet, but hopefully in the future that it will increase its contributions. So by and large, there is a very complex landscape of access and benefit sharing at the national, regional, and multilateral level, encompassing and touching upon a range of different genetic resources. What does this mean for PABS? Well, PABS interacts with all of these different mechanisms, or potentially a number of these different mechanisms at different times. And a single genetic resource could fall under multiple access and benefit sharing systems, including PABS in the future, depending on where that resource was collected from, who it's used by, and how it's used by. So to give an example from the influenza space, a physical influenza sample which has human pandemic potential could fall under the PIP framework, but the digital sequence information associated with it could fall under PABS and the CBD, but it might also fall under national or regional access and benefit sharing systems, because both PABS and the PIP framework recognize that states retain sovereign rights over their genetic resources. So states are still free to do bilateralism even with these multilateral systems. So what we see is a very confusing landscape. And the PABS system starts to recognize how confusing this landscape is. Article 12 calls for alignment of the national and regional measures with PABS to the extent that it's possible to do so, whilst recognizing that states retain sovereign rights over their genetic resources, which means that they don't have to align their domestic systems with PABS if they believe it is not in their interests to do so. But as you can see, there are a number of countries around the world that apply access and benefit sharing rules to pathogens, and other countries as well who choose not to, and still some that apply this to digital sequence information as well already. And we're seeing increased countries changing their domestic access and benefit sharing systems so that it encompasses digital sequence information, including PABS biological sequences as well. And for multilateral mechanisms, as I outlined, there's interaction with the CBD Cali Fund, there's interaction with the PIP framework as well. And this leads to a difficult question that member states must grapple with. Is PABS going to be the only game in town for pathogens? And if so, are you going to disapply other access and benefit sharing systems at the multilateral, regional, and national level, which may encompass PABS biological material within their framework? If so, how does that interact with the fact that member states in Article 12 recognize that member states retain sovereign rights over their genetic resources? This is something that needs to be addressed. If PABS is to be a one-stop shop, then there needs to be recognition of that. But whilst bilateralism remains on the table, there is the possibility that member states can choose to contribute their biological materials ought to fall under PABS directly do bilateralism to negotiate with a third-party entity for benefits to flow back to those. This is a free rider problem which has been recognized within access and benefit sharing, which we've written about previously, and there are references to it in the writing. So why is all of this important? Well, first of all, there is a need to ensure coherence and avoid fragmentation of the landscape, which is currently happening. An unclear scope of PABS, of what samples are in, what samples are out, whether it's a very broad scope or a very narrow scope, whether bilateralism is allowed or whether it's not allowed, leads to regime overlaps and uncertainties for providers and users. This raises a particular problem because it might be the case that users who owe obligations under PABS might not be aware of those obligations, because it's unclear to what international or domestic system they actually owe the obligations to. So clarity is really needed to ensure that users can actually contribute to the benefits that they are required to do so. But this is a long-standing issue within access and benefit sharing. As I said, the global commons of genetic resources has been chopped up in a number of instruments dealing with a number of different approaches to genetic resources. And decision 16.2 of the COP at the CBD recognized this and said that we need to have mutual supportiveness and collaboration across access and benefit sharing instruments so that users and providers are very clear on what obligations are owed and by whom. And this coordination is necessary to ensure that PABS gets recognized as a specialized international instrument under the Nagoya Protocol, particularly if member states want to disapply the opportunity of bilateralism and ensure that PABS is the only game in town when it comes to pathogen access and benefit sharing. Because at the moment, that is not the case. CBD and bilateralism still remains on the table. So what do member states actually need to think about? Well, there's a number of things, and we've touched upon some of these in other presentations, so I'll skip to some of the ones that I can talk about a little bit in a little bit more detail. We do need to ensure that access to samples happens in a rapid and timely and unhindered access. This is something that is required so that risk assessments, R&D, product development can begin as soon as possible. We can get ahead of emerging pathogens, know what risks are occurring where in the world. But at the same time, we need to ensure that benefit sharing is, for public health purposes, is firstly clearly defined. What does this mean when it comes to, what is public health risk? Who's deciding that? How are they deciding it? And individual countries will want to know, am I in line to get benefits from this system? Are benefits going to flow back to me? So that needs to be equally as predictable as access to the samples themselves. Access to the benefit sharing, access to the countermeasures that are developed needs to be very, very clearly understood so that member states know that if they are likely to receive benefits from this system or if they need to pursue alternative avenues. That needs to be very, very clear. I think there also needs to be a recognition amongst member states that there is going to be a need to iteratively learn as this system goes on. And, you know, if consensus is reached by next April, hopefully, that is not the end of the show, and that there will be a need for further learnings and further modification and an ability to develop iteratively and learn from what's going well and what's not going well when it comes to the PABS system. This might mean adjustments to scope. This might mean adjustments to benefit sharing arrangements. This might mean the ability to respond to future technological developments in the way that PABS and, you know, the CBD, when it was initially created, did not envisage the fact that digital sequence information would become so big and such a big problem, and we have always been playing catch up with it. So there is a need to recognize that there needs to be proper established monitoring, evaluation, and learning mechanisms that we can continue to develop with PABS, and we can, and you know, that includes issues like running simulation exercises with industry, with member states about how they will behave in the future, how PABS is likely to operate. And this could be supported by things like a science policy interface where member states learn from scientists who use these technologies. And something that the BBNJ has done is set up an access and benefit sharing committee to talk about how benefit sharing should be distributed around the world. And the Plant Treaty are currently going through a process of reevaluating how they look at access and benefit sharing in the Plant Treaty Forum, in particular because the benefits that the Plant Treaty has generated are widely considered to be far lower than that which we had initially hoped the Plant Treaty would generate. So I strongly suggest that member states and the Secretariat reach out to individuals who do ABS within the Plant Treaty and have those mutual learnings from other parts of the access and benefit sharing system. The other thing is about understanding what is happening in other regimes of international law, particularly the CBD and the Nagoya. One of the problems with the PIP framework is that it was developed in parallel with the Nagoya Protocol, largely at the same time, but there were very little overlaps and mutual learnings there, which meant that in very many cases, they don't align particularly neatly. And that's one of the things that we need to avoid for PABS in the future. The other thing that needs to be really addressed in this regard is the financing of the PABS system, which hasn't been meaningfully addressed in the negotiations so far. And the costs of running a system like PABS will be quite high, depending on how large the scope is or how narrow the scope is. But there are a number of things that will need to be costed into running PABS. First of all is the shipping of samples around the world. A broader scope means much more samples being shipped around the world. There is a cost for doing that, particularly shipping biological materials. You can't just stick a FedEx label on a sample and stick it in the post. You know, this is quite secure transfers, which comes with a particular cost. But there will also be costs of liability and indemnification for the products which are to be developed using this. There will also be a cost of distributing those products. You know, if a product is manufactured at GlaxoSmithKline's manufacturing plant on Merseyside in the UK, where I'm from, how is it going to get to country A or country B for distribution? And who's paying for that? All of these things need to be very clearly costed. And up until now, we've been talking quite large, you know, about large principles and about quite technical issues of PABS. But that issue of cost is a really fundamental question that I think needs to be addressed, particularly at a time of increasing budget cuts at WHO. And there's also a need to ensure that there is this coherence with the CBD, with Nagoya, and these other international instruments, as I've touched on. So a couple of things that really need to be meaningfully addressed. The first one is material and temporal scope of the system. What samples are in, what samples are out. PIP takes an approach of pathogens which have influenza samples with human pandemic potential. But that's a very sticky term of art. Whether a sample has human pandemic potential or not is unclear for scientists at a number of points. And sometimes it's a judgment call of that does or that does not have human pandemic potential. So a very clear criteria of what samples are in needs to be made much more clear. And at what point we think something has human pandemic potential needs to be clarified as well. How does this apply to animal pathogens, which might jump a species barrier into humans at some point in the future? We know that most emerging pathogens are zoonotic in nature. Do we only identify them as having human pandemic potential when they begin to infect a human for the first time, when they begin to spread amongst the human population for the first time? Or do we want to go much more upstream to when they begin to emerge and become identified in an animal population? That needs to be cleared. The other issue is around temporal scope, the time of samples being contributed to the system, or when benefit sharing is to occur. Now, general principle of international law is you don't have retrospective activation of international law, but the BBNJ does, which is quite interesting. But let's say, for example, there is an outbreak of Mpox, which becomes a fake. Do benefit sharing obligations apply to those products because they were developed before the PABS system came into force? If it doesn't, then that significantly narrows the opportunity for benefit sharing under the PABS system, and it will only apply to new products developed using PABS biological material, which is a potentially quite limited opportunity for benefit sharing in general. But retrospective activation causes a number of challenges when it comes to international law. The other question is around how will benefit sharing be activated, and how will those obligations be determined? We've heard about how PIP framework chooses to do this through an SMTA2, and the PIP framework, the PIP Secretariat consistently refers to these as legally binding. I consistently don't. I think that there are a number of challenges with the way the contracts are designed. That means enforceability of these contracts. Where will they be enforced? How will they be enforced? By whom will they be enforced against industry if industry doesn't comply with their obligations? I think that needs to be set out very, very clear. And there also needs to be a scoping review before we even get to that point. How many potential users are we talking about? How many manufacturers around the world are we hoping to have benefit sharing obligations attached to? If we're just talking about the very large R&D pharma companies that, that's one thing to try and get contracts negotiated with those. But if we're talking about a number of manufacturers all around the world who are able to manufacture a range of products, we really need to sort of have a scoping exercise, particularly if we're talking about diagnostics and therapeutics and not just vaccine products. We could be potentially talking about thousands of potential manufacturers here, and the legal capacity to negotiate these contracts with these manufacturers and negotiate robust contracts with them needs to be more clearly understood as well, particularly if we're going to negotiate highly personalized, individualized contracts with manufacturers. And this is one of the problems that has led to the plant treaty not having as many benefits as it had initially hoped. It's because of the scale of users and trying to negotiate these individuals' contracts. As I said, there needs to be a much greater emphasis placed on costing and funding of this system and understanding what those costs are. And again, all of this comes back to what's the scope, what pathogens are in, what pathogens are out, what manufacturers are in, what manufacturers are out. All of this inevitably impacts upon the cost and the scale of the system. And there is a need to ensure that benefits outweigh the costs, that the running costs of the PABS system do not outweigh the benefits which will be got back in return. This is central to how effective the system can be, which also relates to the extent to which this can be recognized as a specialized international instrument under the Nagoya Protocol as well. As I said, a lot to get through. We're powering through, but there'll be a lot of time for questions. There's this question about when elements of the PIP framework when elements of the PABS system will come into force. The language at the moment says shall start simultaneously. That doesn't align with what the BBNJ is trying to do with access and benefit sharing, which has a much more iterative learning and development process when it comes to its access and benefit sharing systems, though noting that the BBNJ is talking about a much smaller scope of users, a much smaller scope of samples under it than what PABS is talking about. But if countries are expected to start sharing their samples immediately before any contracts have been negotiated and signed with industry or with end users, that then leads to questions about, well, how much, at what point can we be assured that the samples that we're putting into the system will generate benefits and those benefits will start flowing back? As I said, how PABS interacts with benefit sharing on products that were developed before the PABS system came into force needs to be addressed, as does intellectual property. the extent to which IP rights over PABS materials are allowed to be sought over samples, both modified and unmodified, and end products, needs to have much further clarification, and was a particularly contentious issue previously. But that needs to be clarified to give certainty to end users and to give clarity in this. The final thing that is going to be a particular challenge is the issue of track and trace. So we heard a little bit about the IVTM system, which the PIP framework uses, which tries to track shipments of influenza samples with human pandemic potential around the world. There is a hope that PABS can develop its own track and trace system, but we're obviously talking about a much bigger scale and how that's going to operate. And the challenge of doing track and trace on digital sequence information becomes much, much more complex. How is this to be done? And also in particular, what purpose is this to serve? Why do we want to track and trace? What are we hoping to gain by doing it? Is it going to be linked to generating contracts, to enforceability? To what end is track and trace really there? What function is it there to serve? And in particular, how is it going to work? How is it going to be costed? And what is it to be used for? All need to be meaningfully addressed. And I come to some of the final additional challenges. As I said, benefit sharing obligations. If this is based on contracts, there are concerns about how enforceable these are in a meaningful way. You know, what jurisdiction are they going to be enforceable in? You know, who and how will it be enforced? And there's a great paper by Michelle Rourke who looked at this in terms of the benefit sharing agreements under the PIP framework, which I think there's a lot of learning from about what can be done to strengthen contracts should member states choose to take a contract model. There is also the opportunity, the risk of export restrictions being used. We have to recognize that vaccine capacity in particular is geographically limited to a very small number of countries around the world, most of them in the global north. Should one of those manufacturers have a contract under PABS to supply to provide benefits, what's to stop the country in which that manufacturer is domiciled from using export controls and restrictions to prevent those exports leaving the country and reaching WHO for onward distribution? We saw very clearly during COVID-19, but we also saw it in 2009 H1N1, countries will use export restrictions and export controls until domestic demand is satisfied and their own population is taken care of. Nothing within the PABS annex and nothing within the pandemic agreement so far restricts high-income countries' ability to use those export restrictions to take control of products that have been promised to WHO under these contracts. That needs to be addressed. As we heard earlier, which we addressed with a question, what public health risk and need is actually means, and how that is to be decided and by whom needs much further clarification. By the time a product becomes developed, public health need and risk could be extraordinarily high in a number of jurisdictions all around the world. When that first shipment rolls off the line at AstraZeneca or GlaxoSmithKline or the Serum Institute of India, is it going to be sent to country A or country B? And how will that be decided? And again, we come back to this idea of enforcement and compliance and the level of infrastructure and technical and legal infrastructure that would be required in order to ensure and enforce compliance of these contracts if necessary. We need to ensure that this system is legally certain and predictable, both in terms of access and in terms of benefit sharing. We need to ensure that this is an effective and transparent system, and that it aligns with general principles of international law, all of which become particularly difficult. There is a need to ensure that there's much more stakeholder engagement, particularly to develop learnings from other access and benefit sharing systems like the Plant Treaty, like the BBNJ, to ensure that PABS can align as well with those. And that brings me to time. I'm being gestured at from the corner of the room, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.